As the first quarter of 2024 draws to a close, so too does the first part of my backlog project. It's been an interesting few months. Not quite what I was expecting. The games I've played have sort of bled into one another as I've tackled multiple titles from the list in tandem, approaching each one with a specific set of ideas in mind, but inevitably upending my expectations of what the sum total of the experience would be. The short answer is this: the project is working well so far. However, I may have been a bit too ambitious in my game choices. As I will go into in this video, some of these titles have been easier to embrace than others. The games that I have been able to fit around the maelstrom that is the rest of my life have been much more straightforward to engage with compared to those that demand more consistent time and attention. As such, my definition of success has had to be measured in something other than completion, although I have committed myself to seeing as much of each title as possible in order to have something interesting and valid to say about them. What's present in this first diary entry then is an exploration of what games are in the moment as much as it is about what they represent at their conclusion. In many ways, this is a story not about the ones that very nearly got away, but about myself, my values, my desires, and the joy that comes from finding out that the thing you always knew would be special does actually turn out to be special. Enough waffling. Let's see how I got on, shall we? Just as a recap, here are the games featured in this video, and this format is very much an anthology of essays, so if you're only interested in my thoughts on specific games, I'll put the timestamps in the description so you can skip to the bits you want to hear. Let's get cracking. We were off to a great start this month with a selection of wonderful titles and Onechanbara Z2 Chaos. Many of these felt like a long time coming, experiences that were sitting coquettishly just barely within my peripheral view for many a moon, now finally unwrapped, gorged upon and digested merrily, and Onechanbara Z2 Chaos. It was clear almost from the start of this project proper that my original plans would have to be rethought somewhat, as playing some of these titles start to finish in 1 or 2 sessions each week was absolutely not the right way to approach them. Some of these games I hungrily ate up, while others required a bit of picking at. I didn't finish all of them, but I did find a lot to talk about nonetheless. Here are the 4 short games and 1 longer game I played in January. My first experience with Alan Wake was many years after its debut, then only nominally familiar with Remedy's Max Payne series. Once upon a time I was a massive Stephen King head, and so the idea of a horror game about a writer whose works come to life really intrigued me. It's an okay game. I quite liked it, although Lord knows how I would receive it should I return to it today. I've seen a lot of retrospectives on this title following the release of its sequel lamenting how bad it plays to feel now, which surprised me because at the time I felt like it was a largely smooth and streamlined experience compared to the bitty third-person shooters of the day. One thing I never did, despite owning a copy of it for years, was engage with the game's expansion, follow-up, half-sequel, whatever American Nightmare is. It being the top entry on my Steam library, it's been giving me the eye for years, and so I finally dived in. As the inaugural entry on this backlog list, I have to say I chose a real banger here. I really enjoyed my time with American Nightmare, a pint-sized secondary campaign that transports you from the damp, misty American Northwest to the arid haze of Arizona, a land of rundown skeezy motels, rusted oil derricks, and endless stretches of desert. Trapped in a time loop and with nothing to your name but a meagre arsenal of firearms and your trusty torch, you're tasked with hunting down a weapon to take on the malignant Mr. Scratch, your dark alter ego who is more than willing to throw everything under the night sky in your way. It's all a bit silly, really, with the stilted dialogue and Twilight Zone-esque narration, but it's played mostly tongue-in-cheek, resulting in a game that feels more Evil Dead than it does the dark half, but there's a lot to enjoy here. Frantic, kinetic fights against hordes of dark-shrouded foes, a number of really nicely designed areas to explore and then explore again with a different context, some crunchy live-action cutscenes that feel earnest in a way that only Remedy could really achieve. It's interesting going back to an older game from a studio after they have later established a particular look and tone to their games. Control, while by no means a perfect game, had an incredible presentation, slick editing in its cutscenes, and those big brash font choices for entering new areas. None of that is really present in American Nightmare, of course, beyond some diegetic implementation of the live action stuff. The whole thing is played closer to the given style of the time, but despite this you can still feel the gestational spirit of those later games in here regardless. The melding of in-game and live action was already a staple of the base game, and this is no different here, but the presentation in general is far less cinematic than I was expecting, more pulpy, more made for TV. My guess is that this was what the original was like too, but because it's been so long since I played that game, I've sort of Mandela affected a different idea of what it is in my brain. Funny how that works, isn't it? Returning to something from the 360 era has left me rather misty-eyed and celebratory because I really miss when games looked like this, where the visuals were crisp and full of personality but not bogged down in texture and detail and intricate mo-capped animation. It's something that's really nice to look at but also effortlessly readable in an era where a lot of big budget games really are not. People complain about the yellow paint thing now for good reason, but that's symptomatic of the diminishing returns of chasing fidelity over good art direction. As for the controls, I'm sorry to all my peers, but I simply do not understand what you're getting at when you say these games feel horrible to play. Maybe the remastered version of Alan Wake is balked somehow, but to me this is a great iteration of third-person shooting. One where the need for precision is negated by a cleverly designed auto-aim that means if you fire in the direction of your foe, you will probably hit them. It sort of evokes a vibes-based approach to gameplay in a way that's extremely satisfying to me. That's the cinematic element creeping back in, a world where a schlocky author with no combat training can effortlessly point and shoot at the beasts of his own creation. I will admit, combat does get a bit rote after a while, and the weapon selection doesn't offer up much variety, but for a game that's constantly racing you along, I didn't mind this all that much. Had I needed to do this for 20 plus hours, I think I might feel differently. It's certainly why I'm not all that fond of Control outside of its presentation, but this is the joy of shorter games. It's like fast food, you get in and out before the highs wear off so that the lows barely register. This generation could learn a thing or two from American Nightmare. Brevity, scope, multiple banger needle drops. It's the tits. Just want to also take a moment to talk about the game's arcade mode, a sort of we have mercenaries at home kind of deal that I found surprisingly fun. You have to stick out waves of enemies until sunrise, and the game becomes a dance of death as you toggle between tactical decision making and just running the fuck away. I don't think it has the legs of Resident Evil's iconic offering, but it's certainly a great way to get good B-roll for this section of the video. I cheated a bit with this one because I've already played a fair amount of it, but I wanted an excuse to return and finish the job. I'm really glad I did because this is perhaps the strongest experience of second wind I've ever had with a game. Wandersong is a warm, funny adventure with a quite clumsy feeling but well applied central mechanic. You play a bard named Piet. You navigate the world with your voice. Most of your interactions take the form of various rhythm action routines activated by use of the right directional stick. Unlike others of its ilk, however, precision is not rewarded and bad timings are rarely punished, which I think is a godsend really because unfortunately it's my least favourite aspect of the game and part of the reason why I foolishly put it down the first time round. For its first few hours, Wandersong feels extremely limited in what it offers you. A series of amusing vignettes interspersed with the same loop of travelling somewhere, singing the right notes to activate something, and then moving on. While undeniably charmed by its art style and sense of humour, I found it a bit lacking. In a prime example of that classic diamond miming meme, I was almost literally minutes away from a section that changed up the experience in a way that fully drew me back in. The set pieces became more inventive, the story finally sank its teeth in, and it kept me enthralled right up until the credit roll. It was also at that point that I realised that this game is secretly an RPG, just one without levels, stats, or a conventional combat system. It has the rhythm, scope, and cadence of one, even if the face of it resembles a different kind of game. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what it is about Wandersong that makes it such an appealing experience. The writing is great, often incredibly funny, not just in the written text but also the timing of the animations. For such a blank slate looking character, Piet is very charming, a blend of sweet naivete and relentless goofiness underpinned by that classic RPG protagonist goodness for goodness sake morality. The supporting cast are just as excellent, especially the ornery witch Miriam, whose sullen expression never fails to make me laugh, but even in the NPCs, some of which you interact with but for a moment, there's a lot of characterization going on. It's the touches like these that make or break a role-playing experience, and I thought they really nailed it on this front. Mechanically, still, I could take or leave it. The central means of control does lead to some interesting variations in the game's environmental challenges, but, and I suppose it's crucial to make sure you know I played this on a Switch Lite with slightly dodgy analog sticks, I found the control scheme very clunky, often struggling to contend with the few and far between moments where the game does actually require some form of precision. Occasionally it's also not very clear what the input timings are actually meant to be, which I think is the game's more serious issue. It's nothing a little perseverance can't resolve, and the checkpointing system in the game is incredibly generous. It's clear that the devs did not intend to challenge gate this experience, however it is something to consider for the more dyspraxic of you out there. Despite my gripes, on a conceptual level the central singing mechanic is actually rather interesting because it acts more akin to something like Tears of the Kingdom's Wonder Hand, a sort of jack-of-all-trades means of interacting with the world, as well as a means of reflecting some aspect of Piet's character. Many of the game's challenges task you with making up your own songs or using your voice in some roundabout, more creative way that, in a strange sense, also reminds me of the game Tearaway, which did a brilliant job of coaxing creativity out of less competent players by making its canvases smaller parts of a more curated experience. Those same principles I see throughout Wandersong, only in an oral sense rather than a visual one. By not really being about the music, by shunning the standard practice of intense, punishing pattern recognition, it in turn ends up being far more respectful of the medium than others of its ilk. As the son of musicians, I appreciate this, truly. Wandersong is a prime example of why it's sometimes worth persevering with something you're not completely in love with. I know it gets good 20 hours in as a classic bullshit excuse for bad pacing or underwhelming prologues, but sometimes it speaks to a truth in reality. This second wind felt like a completely different experience to me, and I don't even think it's anything the game was doing all that differently. I was just in a better headspace to appreciate what it was trying to achieve, and I'm incredibly grateful that I went back. Make sure you play it with a controller with a working analog stick though. That helps. I have tried and failed to get into Gato Roboto multiple times, and for such a modest and apparently short game, this feels like an utterly pathetic admission. I always stalled at the first boss, never quite able to get the patterns down to survive their onslaught, and I know for a fact that this is a consequence of my short temper and impatience rather than anything the game's doing wrong. At the time I thought, oh, that's a shame, because this is a very charming little game with a great premise. An action platformer that gives you the ability to jump out of your mech suit to go do cat business is a great take on that familiar Metroid-esque paradigm of expanding exploration. Going back in, I forced myself to sit still, to pay attention and persevere, and wouldn't you know, I found my time with this game to be fun, but not particularly life-changing. Sorry. I'm sure you were expecting revelations, but sometimes games just aren't for you, and that's a cross we all have to shoulder from time to time. Mechanically, it's a solid little shooty platformer with a killer 1-bit art style. Navigating the world feels good, and I really appreciate how pared down and minimalist it is. You don't have to worry about things like health kits or ammo, instead focusing on a more structured form of combat and navigation. Although there are upgrades to be sought out hidden within these levels, the focus is much more on treating these challenges of the game as indicators of pure skill, and the game is all the better for this. Where I am less thrilled, however, is in the boss design, which is often punishing to a frustrating degree, and even in success left me more annoyed than satisfied. The health bars are a little too long, the attack patterns are a little boring. I love all the bits around these moments, but enduring these skill gates is the thing that's stopping me from fully endorsing this game. Beyond anything else, the critical element of this experience, and perhaps why it should be lauded even though I'm not really that enthusiastic about it, is that it required me to sit up and pay attention attention to the craftsmanship on screen, this is not a passive game. There are patterns to recognize, movement timings to master. I don't think I would have made it past that first boss ever had I not already cut my teeth last year on the brilliant Haiku the Robot, a game that properly taught me how to play this kind of game. In a way, that's the title I should really be talking about here, one that has been the catalyst for me finally getting into this genre and the reason I wanted to return to this other game in spite of my grievances. Spoiler alert, Hollow Knight is also on this list for later in the year. Gato Roboto is perhaps the quintessential Devolver Digital game. A neat idea, executed really well, cute, fiendish, thoughtful, deceptive. I didn't end up finishing it. Once again, too caught up in the weeds of a particular boss fight I just could not get the rhythm of down. But I feel like now I've played enough of the game to get out of the prison that is buyer's remorse and to be able to at least have some thoughts on it. It's good, even if it's not really for me. It's definitely worth a look if you have the stomach for the challenges offering. And I hope you appreciate that I got through this entire segment without saying Metroidvania. Right, listen, sometimes a game is just bad and we could all do without the mental gymnastics of trying to draw meaning where there is none, so this section will be brief. Onechanbara Z2 Chaos is a hack and slash game with very little to offer. It looks awful, it feels horrible to play, and yet, I did kind of enjoy my brief time with it. Onechanbara is a series well known in certain demographics, especially if, like me, you really got into Japanese media as a teenager without scrutinizing whether the things you engaged with were even that good or representative of the culture as a whole. They weren't, but the turn of the century was a desperate, lawless time for aspiring weebs in the UK. You had to buy the anime you wanted to watch on individual DVDs that only held 4 episodes per volume. Kids don't know how good they have it these days. Basically what I'm trying to say is sometimes you lucked out and got Audition or End of Evangelion, and sometimes you got, well, something like this. Bikini Cowgirls Samurai Zombie Slayer is so incredibly 2004 coded, I don't even know where to begin. It's not something I would ever put on while my family were in the room, that's for sure. However, sometimes you do want to switch your brain off and fight zombies with a katana. Sometimes you are a 36-year-old who secretly wishes to feel the way they felt when they saw Ryohei Kitamura's Verses for the first time. And this is kind of why Z2 Chaos is doing the trick for me. There's not a lot else to say. It's a mission-based game with a handful of baffling cutscenes, extremely suspect character designs, and an often not particularly clear narrative. The act of cutting through waves of enemies, sitting somewhere between Bayonetta and Dynasty Warriors is not very satisfying, lacking the crunchiness of those other titles. And the myriad extra options, little submissions and unlockables do little to compel you. Boss fights in particular are horrible, with health bars that go down way too slowly and enemies that barely react to your presence. That's crucially the worst offender of all this. Every single animation in the game feels floaty and lifeless, like trying to fight with cooked spaghetti. It's all a bit of a mess, really. Something that no doubt is designed to appeal to a certain demographic of horny teenager, but, and here's the bizarre thing, in the process they've made a surprisingly unhorny game. Despite the character designs, there is very little about what's presented here that I would even call sexy. You get the occasional bit of decolletage or a suspect camera angle during a finisher move, but for the most part a lot of this is played relatively chaste. I'm not going to chalk this up as a feminist masterpiece or anything, even if it does technically pass the Bechdel test. It's still unbelievably trashy in a lot of places, but I was expecting a lot worse. I think it's good to play games like this from time to time, a sort of cultural reset to put into perspective what the word bad actually means. In another world, this would probably be as revered as Tommy Wiseau's The Room, a crass, badly written and ever so slightly camp rendition of a much better kind of game that I still ended up enjoying my time with. I only didn't finish it because my game froze towards the end of a particularly grueling mission and I just couldn't be asked to carry on from then. Plenty of other good games to be spending my precious time on. Something I've struggled with since its release in 2012 is that Arcane Studios don't just make Dishonored games. What I mean by this is that Prey is not Dishonored, Deathloop is not Dishonored, Redfall most definitely is not Dishonored. The design principles, the layouts and mechanics and even chronology are not one in the same. It's an important distinction going into these games, as it can be a frustrating experience expecting a tried and tested formula to continue working instead of meeting the game on its own merits. Part of that difficulty comes from a struggle to recognise that the immersive sim, even as a genre indicator, is not a fixed point on a map, but rather a collection of understandings about how a player interacts with a world. Despite requiring a different breathing rhythm going into them, all of these games run on the recognition that there is some logic that spools throughout the spaces you navigate and explore. Despite the differences, each of Arcane's outputs have a particular feel and aura to them that is, by all accounts, quintessentially Arcane. That transcontinental flair, the physicality of the game spaces, worlds that feel lived in, world building that feels mechanically relevant. These are the things that made me fall head over heels with the Dishonored trilogy, and it's a principle that goes all the way back to 2002 and Arx Fatalis. What a premise. What a great collection of ideas. A world where the surface, a frozen wasteland, is hostile to life, those that exist reside in huge labyrinthine cities buried deep inside mountains. Magic is real, runes etched into the air in real time. Goblins are real, and they have both a functioning economy and cultural values. Not great ones, but they're certainly there. Arx Fatalis is a game that's incredible to explore. Its world a winding spider's web of passages and caves, hidden doors and contraptions. There's a great physicality to your actions and the world around you, sort of akin to the way things exist in the later Elder Scrolls titles. Items need to be grabbed from the world and dragged into your inventory. Equipment can be equipped straight from the world itself. Nothing is treated as abstract, as nonsense game logic, and it's immediately clear playing today just how prescient an experience this must have felt at the time of launch. I didn't get into PC gaming until the late 2010s, so I don't have a background in these older titles, their esoteric systems or common tropes of the time. I've played a few, struggling to come to terms with those later quality of life staples not being there. However, Arx seems to sidestep the usual issues I have with games like these because it's sort of doing its own thing, existing outside of time. This is a game that only really feels like it's of its era on a graphical level because nothing about its mechanical layer feels at all like any of the other classics from the era. I suspect, and this is something other writers have clocked onto before, that this is symptomatic of coming from a time when a lot of now established genre tropes just did not exist. The blueprint of game design wasn't so cannibalistic, with creators instead looking outside of their own medium for sources of inspiration, and such a choice not even being seen as all that bold or outside the box. Weirdly enough, a lot of this feels more akin to a point-and-click adventure game than a traditional RPG. Items combine in interesting ways, the solutions to a lot of your quests rely on how things interact with the spaces around them. At one point you have to make a poisoned pie to force a Goblin King to have a toilet emergency, and by make I mean you literally combine flour and water, knead the dough with a rolling pin, add a bottle of wine into the mix and leave the concoction by the fire to let it bake. It's such a brilliant, fiddly little system that breathes further life into an already electric world. It is here that I start to have an issue with this whole backlog project. There simply is not enough time for me to give things like this their proper due without having to neglect other entries. As such, I haven't gotten very far into this game, so there is a wealth of stuff I haven't properly engaged with, such as the magic mechanic, which itself is a cool but kind of janky system of mouse-directed gestures in sequence that provide a myriad of effects. Based on how many areas of the world I can't seem to get to right now, I'm sure there are spells galore designed to navigate this environment, bringing Arx Fatalis back into glorious ImSim territory, and certainly it feels like a lot of this is the blueprint for what Arcane would later go on to master in those beloved Dishonored games and beyond. In spite of my comparatively brief time with it, I love this game, and I'm going to keep chipping away at it when I have the time because I honestly adore what it's doing and how it sits within the historical context of the genre. A brilliant, brilliant work. Long may Arcane continue. February was an interesting month for me because on top of the backlog games I had planned to play, I also found myself engaging with other things alongside them. This came from having the extra time afforded to me by virtue of no longer working near constant 6-day work weeks at my day job. It's amazing how much weight gets lifted off your shoulders when your dentist stops recommending thousands of pounds worth of surgery. There was an elephant in the room I had to contend with, however, an extremely hyperbolic full stop to this month, the release of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. The one game of 2024 I've allowed myself to get hyped up about, and a title that so far I'm enjoying a great deal. It has been a bit of a struggle to put it to one side to get through my list, I can tell you that much. Also, like many of you, I've been playing Balatro, an incredibly Moorish poker roguelike that eats up a horrendous amount of your free time. Great game. When we put these extra flights of fantasy aside, once again the shorter titles have been easier to pick up and chip away at compared to my more lofty ambitions. It has been weeks since I last touched Kerbal Space Program, a game whose prognosis is looking incredibly weak the further into the year I get. But with that in mind, there's been a lot to like about the games I did play and finish this month. Here are the 4 short games and 1 longer game I played in February. Lunistice is another game I've already played a fair bit of, dropping only because I got caught on a particularly tricky bit of platforming. Now, having gone back to it and completed it, I can safely say this is one of the best platformers I've ever played. It's fucking brilliant. A sort of grab bag of different influences, Lunistice is precise and kinetic, a blindingly paced set of challenges that rocket you across maps a la a certain blue hedgehog, you jump and leap around a la a certain fat plumber, and in turn it's also sort of doing its own thing. The design principles here are airtight, doing that classic demo an idea safely then later weave it into more complex challenges thing with gusto, and everything feels great, responsive and clearly readable even at the frequently lightning speeds that the game has you going at. There's a beautiful simplicity to its systems as well. You're basically limited to a jump, a double jump, and an attack that can be chained into a triple jump. And the player character's abilities never change from start to finish. Where the variety seeps in is how the environment changes the context of those abilities. Enemy design is limited but easily readable and built into the level layout. Bits of the environment have their own behaviours, changing the way you navigate, the speed at which you vault across time and space, and it all builds towards this wonderful symbiosis of platforming perfection that is damn near best in show. There is a story running throughout the game, pieced together through messages unlocked only by accessing the most challenging side routes of any given level, which is a kind of brilliant incentive to keep playing to improve on your platforming skills. Each level has within it a secondary exit locked off until you reach specific criteria, and these are essential to reach the true ending of the game. The story itself is nothing amazing really, a kind of funky post-apocalyptic jumble of ideas that mainly add a bit of flavour to a game whose world is not very coherent or immersive. One of the only real issues I have with the game is that its character and enemy designs on an aesthetic level leave a lot to be desired. I know challenge and game feel are key indicators of whether a platformer is going to be good or bad, that's why Thomas's Alone is so celebrated, but part of the magic of mascot platformers is that the popularity of their designs quickly transcend the material they originated from. Part of the reason why Sonic the Hedgehog has remained such a potent cultural touchstone over the years when most of the franchise's output has been lackluster, to put it diplomatically, is that the character itself is just a stonking bit of design. A blue hedgehog wearing trainers? That's rad. Here in Lunistice land, there's less of that good stuff, but the trade-off is that the experience of playing the game absolutely rips to a radical degree. It's hard to be mad about the things it doesn't do, since this mortal form is but a vessel to drive the player towards more great gameplay, and the end result is a platformer that I hungrily devoured in next to no time. My easiest recommendation on this list so far, I'd gladly play a dozen of these. Like Alan Wake's American Nightmare, this is a sort of faux nostalgia-driven choice, given that I have no previous experience with it. Again, the desire to play this is born from a place of longing for an era of games that, in reality, still exists, but doesn't quite feel the same anymore. We both changed, and the hellish tide of entropy will never cease, but every now and then you can come to an experience that settles that tremor in the pit of your stomach and tell you explicitly that the unbridled joy of shooting a dude in the face still rules. I never played Call of Juarez Gunslinger when it first launched. In fact, I've never played any of the series, although I know most of them are well regarded in certain circles. This game is cool. A bawdy Wild West shooter with a scoring and perks system that rewards precision and skill. It does exactly what it says on the tin, with the added bonus of some interesting unreliable narrator meta-narrative stuff that allows the game to get a bit silly with its scenarios from time to time. The narrative framing of this whole thing, a bawdy gunslinger chatting shit in a local tavern, lends itself to a creativity that sadly never quite lives up to its promise. At its core, shooting a dude in the face is an immensely satisfying experience because not only does it feel and sound great, but visually having a head pop off and a score appear in the space where it once was activates the nastiest neurons in my brain and allows me to forget that these digital avatars are representative of living, breathing human beings that only so much abstraction can obfuscate. This ain't Wolfenstein, baby. Some of these outlaws had families. Who cares, right? What I'm less in love with is how the damage system pretty much obscures your entire screen the moment you take more than 2 shots. It's an appalling design choice that makes the game infinitely harder at precisely the moment you don't need it to, resulting in more than its fair share of deaths. Coupled with this is the incredibly difficult to control dueling bits that task you with dragging a reticule that seems to be weighed down by oxen across the screen to take out your foe before they do the same to you. It's governed by rules not well signposted and seemingly arbitrary, and it really spoils what would otherwise be an absolute blast to play, given that what is here really struggles to move the barometer from good to great, and these two particularly glaring grievances of mine, I'm hesitant to recommend this as a good first-person shooter. Bits of it are great, it's just sometimes hard to see behind that wall of bullet holes. Undertale is one of those games that, while I haven't actually played it directly, I know enough about it through watching Let's Plays and general cultural osmosis to appreciate what it's doing and the impact it's had on games being made today. A fascinating, unusual metatextual fantasy RPG with a cast of instantly iconic characters, a sweet and complex story, and a job lot of bangers on its soundtrack. What's not to love? Given that the cost of entry was precisely $0, I figured I'd give follow-up Deltarune a go, and like many other titles on this list, got distracted without giving it enough attention. This has now been corrected, and my word, what a great little thing this is. Deltarune at the time of writing is an incomplete project. Developer Toby Fox has released the first 2 chapters into the wild, with a third allegedly nearing completion and 2 more to follow. This is, as far as I can tell, the only game on my backlog list that is technically unable to be completed. However, within the remit of this project, I wanted an excuse to dive in and see what's been going on and how it exists in conversation with the phenomenon that was that original game. This really is what you want from a follow-up to Undertale, cribbing a lot of the same mechanics but with a new cast of brilliantly designed characters subverting your expectations, and the old ones still knocking about in the background as a decent bit of fan service. You need good hand-eye coordination for this game. Combat success depends on your ability to dodge projectiles, but beyond that, a lot of the environmental hazards and many of the puzzles require timing and precision. This is not something you can lazily tool around with while watching reruns of American Dad, or whatever your current brain poison is, but this is also to the benefit of the more static elements of the game, because even with a passing knowledge of what Undertale was attempting to do, I can see clearly that Deltarune is a marked response to that in many ways. Even right at the beginning, having you create a character and then immediately saying, fuck off, you're playing as Chris now. What I understood Undertale to be was a rumination on player choice in games beyond the simple consequences of what happens on screen in the moment. That permanence lingering between playthroughs, spoken out loud by characters who exist outside of the game's internal logic. What you do will be remembered. Your actions have meaning even after you shut the game down. Someone will always know that this is what you are. Deltarune Chapter 1 takes this concept and then asks, How do you contend with this dilemma in a party setting? What do you do if one of your friends and allies is volatile, violent, and does not agree with the path that you want to take? This simple change alters the way you approach combat in a really interesting way. Your troubled party member Susie, a take on the classic berserker role, cannot be controlled directly, hits like a truck, and can easily kill your opponents unless you can meet the criteria to spare them first. It becomes a tug of war between protecting yourself and protecting them that turns the binary dynamic of RPG combat on its head completely. This is the ludonarrative good stuff right here, and it's not the only thing the game is doing either. Not content with framing the party dynamic as static, Susie eventually develops into a much more interesting character, both narratively and mechanically, and already by the start of Chapter 2 you find that the focus has been shifted towards a different kind of experience altogether. Unfortunately, what that means is I'm less enthralled by Chapter 2 than I was Chapter 1, although it is a more fleshed out and mechanically engaging experience. The world is far more full of interesting navigation puzzles. The non-lethal route combat has you recruiting your opponents to move into your town with a variety of effects, most notably a brilliantly fun, big anime-esque finale. But with Chapter 1 ending in such a deranged fashion, and the volatile party dynamic now mostly reconciled, I found the narrative beats of Chapter 2 less compelling, even if its world was more interesting to navigate. It's a shame, because Deltarune starts off with such a strong narrative foundation and a brilliant cast of characters, and then it just doesn't seem to know what to do with them. As a gameplay experience, I can't fault it. As a story-rich JRPG, I have my concerns, but I also have to reconcile with the fact that this is not a complete experience and won't be for quite some time. Toby Fox has stated that he's already penned out the full arc of the game while development is still chugging along, and while chapters have clearly been designed to be enjoyed in isolation, they are part of a wider story, and that must be taken into account when talking about this game. In a peculiar way, this reminds me of the process that Kentucky Route Zero took, with often years between acts releasing. Only, in that case, I came to the project right at its conclusion and missed out on the context of years of yearning. Here, with Deltarune, I am almost at the starting line of a saga that has every potential to be something truly special, something more than just Undertale 2. Godspeed to Toby Fox and his team. I wish you all well. Sometimes a game can be sold on just a handful of screenshots, and the ones I first saw of Eve in the Ocean really lit me up. This is a game that has a really evocative art style, big autumnal sunset end of the world vibes, with a Final Fantasy VI-esque world map and a great looking protagonist. I bought it without a second thought, then just never really played it. This is a common problem I have with backlog games. I think I like buying more than I do playing. The two actions give me very different types of dopamine, and I'm sure at some point I will probably need to reckon with this admission as a symptom of a wider problem, but this is what the Backlog project is here for, to address these desires and make them wholesome again. Having now finished Eve in the Ocean, I can firmly say you need to play this. A platformer wrapped in the robes of a JRPG, Eve in the Ocean is a game about navigating various dungeons, taking the form of silos, power plants, and even the insides of fearsome beasts, in order to address an energy imbalance and save the world from a coming apocalypse. Player-directed mechanics are limited, and for good reason. The environments do all the talking. Within each dungeon lies a myriad of obstacle courses where hazards must be overcome using dexterity and a 4-directional shield. Protagonist Aleph can run and jump, hold their shield in whatever direction they need, do a touch of wall jumping, and, well, that's it. The game has a touch of Celeste about it in this regard, as the central means of movement are concise, finely tuned, and incredibly versatile. Where the environment comes into this is in how two specific energies interact, light and dark. You don't have a traditional health bar, instead your body reacts to these two energies in different ways. Too much of one particular energy will result in a fail state that takes you back to your last save point. But in the margins between life and death, another more interesting effect happens. More light energy allows you to jump higher, more dark allows you to run faster, and many of the game's challenges are built around how these two things affect momentum. momentum. It's a brilliant idea, one that holds up right until the final moments of the game, but also one built into the game's world and story perfectly. This is ludonarrative harmony at its finest, and also highlights the game's other great strength. Not just a platformer, even the ocean is also an excellent fable about the conflict between nature and mankind, a sort of riff on Final Fantasy VII's "we are the tools of our own destruction" motif. The game's storytelling excels because of the precision and care it has. A small cast of brilliantly realised characters, a plot that feels suitably epic but in a concise and bite-sized way. Everything melds together nicely, working within the constraints of the project's capabilities, and this is actually the really impressive thing about Even the Ocean. It was made predominantly by just 2 people. Developers Melos Hantani and Marina Kitaka previously worked on Anodyne, which, spoiler alert, will feature in a future backlog video. I have way too many games. It's been interesting looking at the credits and seeing how the division of labour has been formed, with neither developer channeling into just one specific aspect of the game. Art and coding built together, synchronised beautifully. As I'm not a developer myself, I cannot say for sure, but it seems to me that this way of working has contributed to the success of the final result. Ambition never feels crushed by scope. What concessions have been made are stylised to fit the overall tone that the game has, its picture book quality, its narrative structure, all coalescing nicely. There are clear limitations present throughout. This is a game with few moving parts beyond what is absolutely necessary. Cutscenes are static images coupled with text boxes, but the framing of these is quite nice, and the low fidelity has this dreamlike effect, like you're half remembering an experience you weren't quite a part of, which, given the structure of the story, makes perfect sense. It's still a concession. I know making anything work in game dev is a miracle, especially once ambition creeps into the fold, but it's a concession that has been managed with a brilliant artistic hack. I have no complaints. A great little experience, one of the best things on this list so far. It's fitting that my first time firing this game up for this project met me with a notification that it might not run properly on my PS5. Then, almost immediately after, it crashed. Good comedy is priceless. So yeah, Left Alive is a fascinating mess. I spent a few hours in the game earlier last year, curious as to what exactly was so bad about this universally reviled work. On paper it sounded like a winner. Tactical stealth game set in the Front Mission universe, a delicious role reversal that pits you against ground troops and fearsome mechs, survival elements, optional goals in each mission to help lead survivors to safety, cover art by Yoji Shinkawa, Mr. Metal Gear himself. Visuals look nice, the menus slick and stylish, so what's the big deal? It's horrible to play. That's the big deal. I've never experienced a more clunky, awkward game that still required precision and finesse of me. It's a hard pill to swallow at first, one that doesn't really get any easier the more you play. Between the janky controls, dumb as bricks enemy AI, and a laughable story, it's been a struggle just playing enough of this game to be able to say anything about it. It's a real shame, because if even one of these flaws was less grating, what you'd end up with is kind of cool, in theory at least. It's clear from the get-go that one of the major influences of this is Metal Gear Solid, and in particular Guns of the Patriots. Urban warfare has never looked more gnarly, more impressive as you navigate tight alleyways and vicious open spaces in equal measure. The clunkiness comes back to haunt you time and time again though. This is not a game that offers up much variety in how you can handle any given encounter because the punishment for failure is so brutal. But within this, there does lie a kernel of something interesting. One of the key things about this game is that you're really not meant to take your foes head on. Even should you ignore this advice, the gunplay is so horrible that you would likely return to the shadows within seconds anyway. Just the act of aiming a weapon is probably the worst a game has ever felt to me. Add to this a horribly implemented cover system and a bizarre control scheme, and you have a recipe for disaster. Mark my words, this is not a game that you can just vibe out of. You need to plan ahead, and as you can see from the footage playing here, that's through the magic use of Molotovs, IEDs, and other jerry-rigged minutiae. And guess what? These don't bloody work half the time either. This is the meat of Left Alive. Its most interesting idea ground down into the mud. Survival in a war-torn hellscape. Outgunned, outmanned, you have no allies, only non-combatants who need your help, giants of metal and fire bearing down on you from an impossible horizon, a technologically superior foe who's taking no prisoners, resulting in a game where you have to make use of whatever the environment can give you to fight the good guerrilla fight. In better hands, this might even have become a cult hit. As it stands, it's all rather disappointing, as even should you properly engage with the systems at play here, the enemies quite often do not. Your foe has two states in this game, it seems: completely unaware of your existence and you're already dead. Depending on environmental factors, it's also remarkably easy to trigger their AI to forget you were ever there, but this doesn't even work to your advantage because everything is so damn static and unassailable. There are dead zones everywhere. At some points I found myself standing in broad daylight with soldiers definitely looking right at me, not a care in the world. In other moments, hidden behind burning shipping containers or the ever-present knee-high walls, a Wanzer would suddenly be gifted omniscience and fire a barrage of rockets at me. The signposting is awful, and I never felt like I had a good grasp of my environment or which areas were safer than others, even when the map beats you over the head with this information. The game does have this interesting take on the Dark Souls thing of having other players' deaths become a heat map that allows you to navigate away from the more treacherous areas of any given level, but again, this is rarely used in interesting ways, and to be honest I found it to be a pointless addition anyway, given that the AI that accompanies you barks at you whenever you're even slightly near an enemy. You'll hear this constantly throughout the game. This is the crux of Left Alive's problems. It's not a boring game by any stretch of the imagination. It has ideas and it gives those ideas a real go of it, but the final result is an experience that is rammed with audiovisual noise, an attempt to do way too much when they haven't even nailed down the fundamentals like movement or aiming a gun. Even the rare moments where you get to pilot a Wanzer are horrible. And I know it's not helped by me recently playing Armored Core 6, but Jesus Christ, just look at this. This is a game that came out in 2019. A title produced by Square Enix, a company that, while not exactly prestige anymore, at least has a reputation for rolling out finished products that feel alright to play. I'm endlessly baffled by so many ambitious swings all missing. I cannot in good faith recommend this. March begins as March always does in the UK, too bloody cold and with the hellish anxiety of knowing you're going to have to start paying your council tax again soon. With this in mind, I've managed to curate an interesting list of games for the month, and I was determined to get one big last push in with Kerbal Space Program so that I can offer up something substantial to say about it in the final act of this video. I also somehow managed to play 25 hours of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, which I won't go on about, but boy, if that game hasn't got me feeling conflicted. Maybe the subject of a future video essay, but for now, here are the 4 short games and 1 longer game I played in March. In the moments between the origins of survival horror as an established genre and now, very little has changed, and for good reason. Being trapped in a place with bad vibes, a parade of gooey freaks nipping at your ankles, and an ever-dwindling cache of resources to keep you alive, that was all but perfected in the original Resident Evil, and in the decades that followed, many games appeared that proved that the formula is all but perfect, no matter the fidelity. The Final Station is a key figure in this argument for me, a game I've shamefully spent very little time with in the past, not because it's bad, but because it puts the shits up me too much. Something about the lo-fi, pixelated creatures that don't even have textures or a colour palette, brought to life only by animation, the extremely claustrophobic environments they catch you in, and the fact that even a single one can reduce you to a fleshy pulp in seconds if you aren't quick enough on the draw, makes every second spent in this game feel like an hour. The setup for the game is pretty inspired. You are a conductor for a train scene in a world lost to a gooey black sludge that turns ordinary people into vicious creeps. Due to the influence of a mysterious council, each station visit locks your train in and requires accessing a code from the station master in order to disengage from this lock and keep moving. Obviously, in most cases, the station master is long dead and the code hidden deep within a maze of doors and hatches, each one hiding all manner of threats behind it. This is the bulk of the game and its greatest strength. The fog of war is so dense here that you're never really quite sure what you're going to find, whether it's precious health kits and ammo in a locker room or something wicked hiding in the toilet of a long abandoned house. The problem is, you are almost always compelled to look, even though reason and logic would tell you absolutely not. The keys to your success and the invitation to your demise can be found literally anywhere in a level, and to compound this, the player character is not the only person whose health and well-being you have to look after. The thing that the final station does that other survival horror games rarely do well is make the world much bigger than just your own needs. As the last bastion of humanity's struggle to connect across a warped and ruined landscape, you will come across survivors and you will have to make difficult choices regarding their safety. Survivors require food and health, and those resources have to come from the same pool that you rely on, and the game is incredibly stingy with giving you things. There are monetary rewards for getting them to their required destination, but given how rare merchants are, it's hard to look at this as a primary motivator for keeping these folk alive, and it quickly becomes as much a part of the routine of these journeys as maintaining the various parts of the train are. While the writing itself is not outstanding per se, the little conversations that these people have during the transport help to make an otherwise narratively frugal game feel more alive. It is unfortunate that the train sections are among the game's weaker moments. I would have liked to have seen this be more involved. There's a juggling act you have to play in keeping the voltage of various bits of machine within safe levels, and it almost feels like a precursor to what Far Lone Sails is doing with this time, action and resource management idea. However, it never really ventures even into doing multiple things territory, with each journey just picking one thing to keep an eye on, like it doesn't trust you to be able to handle anything more strenuous. There's a lot to like about the final station, but there is one specific design choice that I think works to its detriment more than anything else: its checkpoint system. While individual levels are not particularly huge, the game is very generous about where it places you if you should succumb to the sweet release of death. Failure never puts you back more than a few rooms, so should you make a silly mistake, you can jump straight back in. I don't think this system works for two reasons. One, it undercuts the tension of the gameplay, and two, it frequently leaves you in shit situations where you have no health or ammo and are trapped in an unending loop of death. The level design does not support this. There are very few ways through each challenge other than resource management and precision in combat. If you're out of bullets and low on health, there is nothing you can do, and these generous checkpoints end up being little more than reinforced cruelty. Thankfully, these checkpoints are not hard saves. Quitting out and reloading brings you back to the beginning of the level, and while resource use carries from stage to stage, you usually return to the train with enough material to craft some bullets and a health kit or two. There is a long game to be played here, and in this I find a much more compelling idea. I think also that should failure bring you back to the start, the tension of both the known and the unknown would ramp up immeasurably. Having said that, the final station is a tense, stressful experience, one that I think mostly succeeds at what it sets out to do. Its dev team, Do My Best, are an interesting bunch, going on to release last year's Bookwalker Thief of Tales, a strange little RPG that I enjoyed a lot while having a few reservations. I find it more compelling when a team has a solid core idea, even if the execution leaves a little to be desired, and while I do think there is room for improvement in this particular style of game, should anyone else want to take a crack at it, what is here is worth investing in. It's inarguable that the way that modern games are curated to within an inch of their lives has an impact on how immersive they can be. The push for fidelity over player freedom and this singular execution of a specific idea can result in some grand experiences on occasion, but I always feel like what we lose in the process is far more damning. What is a good game if not one that facilitates the one thing that no other medium does? It is with this in mind that many years ago I bought Westerado, sold on the idea of it by a great article on Eurogamer, which I'll link in the description. In it, writer Sam Greer praises the game's open-ended approach to storytelling, utilising the random allocation of persons of interest and freedom to act independent of context, citing these as things other games could learn from. It sounded fab and, well, guess what happened? The placement of the game on this list is an attempt to correct this neglect. Westerado begins with that time-honoured tradition of a rancher chasing cattle only to return home to find it ablaze and his family murdered. From here you begin your investigation, seeking out clues to the identity of the murderer in order to seek out justice, and it's immediately clear that, goddamn, this game has the juice. Westerado follows a design principle I love dearly in that it keeps its mechanics simple and instead offers variety in how the environment changes the context of your actions. Your central means of interacting with the world is via the big iron on your hip, a weirdly granular process to use it. You draw out of the holster with one trigger, cock the hammer and fire with another. It's a 3-point process. Straight off the bat, you see just how versatile this simple language set is when in the first 5 minutes of the game you've used your weapon to put your brother out of his misery, shown it off to a gun enthusiast, dragged a tavern dweller kicking and screaming back to his wife, and engaged in a gunfight with bandits. It's an immediately brilliant setup because it leads to so many interesting experiences throughout this world, but it also has that layer of friction to the process that not only makes the game immersive, but also forces you to think about your actions before you take them in a way most other games don't. 2 games spring to mind playing this. The first is Way of the Samurai, a series somewhat left in the dust of an older generation that offered up a similar experience only with a blade instead of a gun, giving you a space to explore and a non-committal route through its story that made it a compilation of loads of fascinating vignettes that eventually tied together into an interesting, chewy overall experience. The other is Fallout New Vegas, and more specifically the storyline in which you help moody sniper Boone identify and kill the person who kidnapped his wife. While the investigation canonically leads you to a culprit, there was nothing stopping you from just finding any suspect you didn't like the vibes of and sending them on their way. A premium dickhead move for sure, but going a long way to explaining the appeal of New Vegas even today. Westerado carries this torch by allowing you to point your weapon and fire at anyone you like, consequences be damned. Well, consequences not be damned actually, because this is the Wild West, baby. Everyone has a shooter. One of the first things I did was visit the oil baron in his mansion and blow his brains out, only to succumb to the blissful release of hot lead. Not a productive use of my time, but it made me feel better, and that's surely what matters most. Westerado is an interesting experience for this reason alone. A lot of games, even ones in alleged open worlds like the Big Cowboy game, you know the one I'm talking about, give the illusion of freedom when in reality they are leading you along by string, treating the player like the cattle they're rustling in-game. On occasion they may let you choose the path to your predetermined destination, or let you go off and kill mountain lions or elk in order to craft a new bandolier, but so rarely do these experiences embrace the idea of being wholly diegetic and the chaos of abandoning your hopeless cause in pursuit of something either more noble or completely abhorrent, and everything in between. In Westerado, I think the illusion probably still stands. This is not a total degree of freedom still, but it's employed in a much more clever way here. You can have diegesis in curated experiences too. The devil lies in the details, how well these things are crafted in totality, not just their worlds or their writing or mission design or even the integration of the user interface into such experiences, but in how the player is allowed to engage with all of these elements on their own terms. Having an experience genuinely put the onus in your hands to figure out how to live and how to seek out justice is an impressive trick that makes the game feel 100 times bigger than it actually is, and by putting emphasis on a single cocked hammer, a single pull of the trigger, that's something all the Red Deads in the world even struggle to achieve. Great game. Thanks to some corporate bullshithousery, it is being delisted very soon, so I implore you that should this even remotely interest you, that you seek it out now before it's too late. There is some amount of technical wizardry going on in House House's avian arsehole simulator Untitled Goose game that cannot go unappreciated. While the game itself seems quite straightforward, albeit polished and pristine, it's in its adaptive soundtrack that we find something quietly impressive. You probably recognise at least some of the tunes plinking away with every slap of webbed foot on grass and tarmac. Debussy's Preludes is perhaps the perfect soundtrack to the tomfoolery that you will be engaging with in this game, but what makes it stand out more is how beautifully it's tied to your movement and actions. While still feeling organic, it genuinely hurts my head trying to figure out how they even managed this, but I suppose it's the talents of Dan Golding we have to thank. While I have played Untitled Goose Game before, like many of the titles on this list, I never gave it the time it deserved. Initially putting it off as some kind of twee nonsense, I've now come to appreciate how much that presentation informs the experience. The layout of this quaint little village, the detail in the various props you can utilise for your own malevolent ends, it paints the picture of an idyllic community brought into a new reign of terror by the honking justice of the natural world. It's no coincidence that the first few objects you come across are discarded carelessly in the river you start in, hidden just far enough away from the town to not be of any concern to its residents, who are normally obsessively compelled to put things back in the right place. If there is a central thesis to Untitled Goose Game beyond bullying Tories is fun, it's this. Every slice of this particular paradise comes at the cost of community, of a true oneness with the outstanding natural beauty of the areas these places are built into. The ultimate NIMBY game. Nature at war with humanity as our last pond-dwelling warrior takes on what turns out to be the ultimate heist, facing off against an immortal army of perennial shewers, neat lawns, warm pints, and a generational fixation with the way things used to be. It's amazing how authentic an experience of small-town UK all this feels, considering how it comes from an Australian studio. I grew up in a place not too dissimilar to this. The tweeness of that space, the unwillingness to coexist with the animal world even in such a rural, idyllic space. While not explicitly reckoned with, there is a clear intent in that which has been omitted, as much as there is in what is on the screen plain as day. It's a stretch, I know. I'm definitely reaching in my analysis of what is essentially a game about a goose committing acts of vandalism, but I only do so because I'm hesitant to really talk about this game on a mechanical level. Because as a puzzle game, as a stealth game, as a Rube Goldberg machine of interconnected actions, it all falls short of the mark. No one thing in Untitled Goose Game is particularly inspired or brilliant. The controls are awfully fiddly, the capital G gameplay doesn't really evolve much past the basic idea of, isn't it funny that a goose is being naughty? The game looks like its checklist of goals should interact a lot more than they actually do. There's a remarkably simple A to B process for almost everything you have to achieve in order to progress. The town itself is interconnected in ways that are basically not utilised for anything interesting. Should you take Untitled Goose Game as its composite parts alone, you would find a game that maybe would get a rise out of you for a moment, but not enough to maintain its admittedly quite nice runtime. But this is the kind of game you have to immerse yourself in, as a party bag of unusual vignettes and just generally a vector for facilitating that one admittedly very good joke of creeping up behind someone and honking loudly so that they drop something or fall on their ass. It's good fun for the moment you're playing it. I don't know if it has any lasting appeal beyond that, but it hasn't stopped me being excited for the style and ambition of House House's newly announced next game, Big Walk. Hotline Miami is one of those games that I appreciate more conceptually than I do actively enjoy playing it. Any kind of game that requires intense hand-eye coordination and the ability to come up with a new plan on the fly the moment your masterful gambit doesn't quite work is a bit of a no-no for me. It's one of those things where I don't wish for the experience to be different, but feel a deep dissatisfaction with my own body for not being able to read what it is trying to show me. Of all the games on this list so far, God's Trigger is the one title I genuinely knew nothing about, to the degree that I didn't even realise it was going to be one of these one-hit, one-kill, top-down brawler shooters in the vein of that other iconic title. And initially I was thrilled at the prospect of a colourful new take on this very niche genre. Getting the negatives out of the way first, this isn't as good as Hotline Miami. You may feel like it's unfair to compare any number of coughing babies to a veritable atom bomb, but I think the comparisons here are not only relevant but necessary. As a continuation of the ideas of this particular subgenre, God's Trigger feels less precise in its mechanics, is lacking visually and narratively, and the soundtrack is not quite as good. Although I'm less perturbed by that last point, given that Hotline Miami does have arguably the greatest gaming soundtrack of all time. Again, Atomic Bomb versus Coughing Baby. In any number of criteria, God's Trigger is an unfortunate work in that it's intrinsically going to invite unfair comparison. But what is there and what stands alone is, well, I'm not going to call it a masterpiece, but it is decent. There are some satisfyingly chunky effects whenever you take out a foe, the game reloads almost instantly whenever you fail to clear a room, and there are numerous routes through each level that keep you on your toes, both in tandem becoming a godsend for me as I died almost constantly. Your two characters being mechanically different enough to change up how the game feels to play is a neat touch, and inviting a small degree of customization allows you to feel like you have some control over how things play out. But unfortunately, all of this being coupled with how floaty everything generally feels results more in frustration than satisfaction. It's a hard sell. I see the vision, I see the effort made to create something fun and arcadey in place of that drug-fueled techno nightmare that inspired it, and I find it heartening that developer One More Level went on to make the Ghost Runner games, which I've not played but by all accounts are excellent, precise, and great feeling action platformers. Perhaps we should celebrate God's Trigger in this regard as the stepping stone to future successes, a game to cut your teeth on and recognise the do's and don'ts of making a fast-paced action title. I should have given this more time. More patience. Unfortunately, I suck at it, and my tolerance for repeating sections ad nauseum is extremely low. This itself isn't a value judgment. I also never finished Hotline Miami for the same reason, just a personal preference type thing. Anyway, go play this if you're missing out on that kind of high risk, high reward kind of game. It's not for me, but I'm sure some of you will get a kick out of it. God, there's just something about a fictional detective whose life is completely down the pan, isn't there? While I enjoy the likes of Hercule Poirot and Benoit Blanc, absolute queens just strutting their stuff, I will always hold a place in my heart for the men and women of criminal investigations world who you just know go home to an empty fridge and a recycling bin full of bad beer cans. In Hotel Dusk Room 215, permanently tired, nosy bitch Kyle Hyde knocks it out of the park from minute one because he's not even a detective anymore. He's a salesman. A mundane, domestic situation is the catalyst for anything but. Hotel Dusk is a detective game confined to a single location, with a mystery that is in absolutely no hurry to reveal itself. Be warned, this is not a game that is going to be for everyone. It revels in the granularity of the ordinary, entrusting you to do all the things that most games conveniently take out of your hands. It's been described as languid and fascinating in equal measure, and I think I'm safely in the latter camp, but only just. I find this kind of quiet oddity absolutely captivating. As someone whose favourite type of films are the ones that are about nothing and everything, very few games manage to capture that essence so well. The ordinariness of life made extraordinary by the people within it, relishing the beauty of prosaic ephemera in that peculiar way that could only be done using the DS touchscreen. There is something about this handheld though, isn't there? Even before the 3DS launched and gave us a true appreciation for this third dimension, there was something about the way 3D games looked on the DS that I don't think ever really translated to any other console, home or handheld. Even coming to this game in 2024, 17 years after its original release, I found myself cooing at the 3D models and how you use the touchscreen to move them around. It's so rudimentary on the face of it. The models themselves are low poly and kind of dull, but if anything, that to me highlights the sort of unbelievable decadence of the era, like we were living in a veritable golden age and just didn't know it at the time. Characters are presented in this incredibly well-realized hand-drawn style meant to evoke Notebook sketches, which do a lot of heavy lifting in bringing these people to life. The Notebook motif is present throughout, tying brilliantly into how the game is played. One thing lost in the translation transition of handheld consoles from bespoke oddities to basically micro PCs with industry standard controllers attached is that this kind of playfulness goes out the window somewhat. Yes, the Switch has a touch screen and the base model can do all kinds of weird and wonderful things, but its design is mired by convention, so much so that very few games take the opportunity to relish in the peculiarities of the form. I know this is due to the way games are now made, cross-console parity being a necessity due to the complexity of the development process. And although you occasionally get big creative swings in more niche markets, like the Playdate for example, most projects would rather house their ideas purely in the digital realm, which is fine. Many of the games featured in this video have a bounty of brilliant ideas to bring to the table without even factoring in the platform they are being played on. But Hotel Dusk, there's something about this game that chains it indefinitely to this handheld. I cannot conceive of this game working on modern hardware at all. It's too kinetic, too diegetic. The magic comes from the forms of interaction, the dull, monotonous repetition of actions made exciting by the process of acting them out yourself. The means by which you can make notes in-game using the stylus is a dream, and then realising that the notebook is an in-universe object that other characters interact with too was truly a special moment. Alongside this, having the game be played in portrait mode is a great choice, because while there are riddles to solve and assorted fiddly bits to interact with, this is primarily a visual novel, a genre I really struggle with due to having the attention span of a gnat. Any text-heavy game has this same issue, and a lot of it comes down to how the text is presented. The dual screen setup gives dialogue instant readability by virtue of locking character-specific lines to each screen. Your eyes are constantly darting from side to side, preventing them from glazing over. It's brilliantly laid out. It's design choices like these that forever remind me that the DS and by extension the 3DS, which I'm playing this on, are the greatest consoles of all time. They made play the verb it was always supposed to be, even in games as slow burning and seemingly passive as this. So, starting this game 3 weeks into the month, and with the ever-present vulture that is Final Fantasy VII Rebirth constantly pecking at me, meant that I haven't given this game as much time as I should have, but it is a title I will keep picking away at, given how much it's already charmed me and how, in the space of a scant few chapters, I am locked in on the mystery at hand. How do you even begin to talk about an entity like Kerbal Space Program? Not so much a game as an evolution of ideas, one that I've come into at the far end of this development process. Inevitably, I am missing so much of the context of its history, but I've also arrived at the perfect time to enjoy the fruits of everyone else's labour. I basically didn't touch this game for the first month. I fired it up and played a few tutorials to get a basic sense of what it wanted of me, but to start it properly was still an intimidating prospect. I had read a good half-dozen reviews of the game at this point, each one talking about what the game was over a decade ago when it first launched and what it is now, calling it an undeniably smoother but still incredibly challenging, ego-breaking experience, but one that, once you finally crack it, feels incredibly rewarding. I never thought I'd have the patience for a game like Kerbal Space Program, something that relishes in precision, in the fiddly minutiae of rocket making, but within minutes of loading the game up, I realised that this is simultaneously not at all what I expected, and everything I feared it would be. The tutorials immediately clocked me onto the fact that despite the silliness of the character designs, this is an incredibly serious game. Like Football Manager serious. A game about building rockets to such a granular degree that even a misplacement of a part or an incorrectly defined parameter could be the difference between your Kerbal returning back to Earth safely and them dying in a fiery explosion in the upper atmosphere. This is a game for maths nerds. A game that probably is not completely authentic to the very real and very complex process of getting man into space, but is close enough to let the layperson understand that this is not just some flight of fancy. It requires knowledge, concentration, planning, more planning, a third and fourth lot of planning, and more than its fair share of luck. This is a game of variables, of weight distribution and trajectories and fuel efficiency and continuity planning for when things inevitably fuck up. It's also a game that's surprisingly easy to get into. Following those rather alarming tutorials that talk about orbital nodes and apoapsis retrograde, and the all-powerful sphere of influence, the campaign mode actually starts you off quite small, giving you access to only a scant few parts and charging you with simple goals. The process of testing, adjusting, and retesting your designs is very endearing, something I found myself getting surprisingly into, and with the quest system in place, having loads of smaller goals to work towards in order to build up science points that would help unlock more rocket parts meant that I was constantly looking at different ways to build myself towards that ever-present dream of exploring deep space. I'll be honest, I was not particularly enthused about getting stuck into this one. It never really excited me to begin with, and I don't even remember how I ended up with a copy in my Steam library. But I wanted to go into the game with an open mind and work towards a number of goals in the process, starting with hitting 70,000 feet and returning to Earth safely. Getting in the air was simple. It was returning to Earth that became the real problem. With many of the quality of life features already in place and a very basic understanding of SAS and turn orders, it was quite a straightforward process of getting a rocket to lift off, gather a few thousand feet, then launch parachutes and watch it slowly glide back to Earth. But a few thousand feet was not going to cut it if we wanted to see the stars, and so I started to look at the logistics of suborbital flight. I needed a powerful engine, I needed fuel, I also needed parachutes with enough stopping power to save me from terminal velocity upon my descent. The first few tests were a disappointment. I found I would have enough oomph to reach the upper atmosphere, but not enough to crush my momentum and return back down. It's clear even at this early stage that there are probably wildly inefficient ways to achieve these goals, but it is possible to MacGyver together some monstrosity that just happens to have the goods in all the right places to achieve what I want. However, I'm still struggling with anything more than the simple fundamentals right now. I managed one flight with a very boring utilitarian rocket that reached the 70,000 threshold and even managed to maneuver and use the last of my rocket fuel to return, only to realize that a fall from 7,000 feet and a fall from 70,000 feet are very different experiences. It was at this moment that I realized that I'm gonna have to learn at least a little bit about physics and a lot about how rockets work. It's good to be humbled in such a controlled environment. There's a sort of wild Icaran beauty to the hubris on display here that I can't help but laugh at, and I think that's the key to understanding why Kerbal Space Program works. Failure is funny, almost keyed into the same energy as the best roguelikes. There is no instance in which a dreadful crash or explosion will not make you laugh and say, back to the drawing board. Kerbal Space Program is generous like that. Failure seems to be a neutral state. You either move forward or stay in the same place. I'm sure a smarter writer would make some astrophysics pun here, but I'm more of a social sciences guy. And unfortunately, it's at this stage that I have to concede something honest and unpleasant. I don't care enough about this game to continue playing it. It remains unfinished, and so too does this particular essay. My original goal after hitting the 70,000 threshold was to maintain orbit and then eventually land on a celestial body, and that's just not going to happen, I'm afraid. Kerbal Space Program is a project you really need to invest in order to get the most out of, and I simply do not have the enthusiasm to do this. To me, I've played enough to understand what kind of game it is, and I'm grateful for that time spent. Maybe in another life, at another time, this would become my next favourite game, but as it stands right now, a swing and a miss. Part of me wishes that I would have given it more time, thought about it more, and lived within the minutiae of its systems, but I strongly feel like this would have been to the detriment of everything else I wanted to achieve with this backlog project. The goal was never to give myself up to sunk cost, it was to discover the things that I should have loved from eras past, and it is unfortunate that the Kerbal Space Program is the last big victim of this temperamental mind. What is the value of working through a video game backlog? For a culture that is forever dominated by the new and the hyperbolic, hundreds of thousands of titles get left by the wayside. Some for good reason, others incredibly unfairly. Already at barely a quarter of the project in, I've found my time with these games so enriching, but in that same breath I reveal to myself a melancholy for what I feel the world should be. How many of the games I've played so far this year were made by studios that no longer exist, or individuals individual developers who can't make a living creating such beautiful things. I want people to be talking about games like Even the Ocean and Lunistice years from now, understanding how these experiences can enrich their lives just as much as those heavily marketed hype machines. I don't want to make this an us versus them argument, especially since I've had the 1-2 punch of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and now Dragon's Dogma 2 to contend with, but I strongly believe that many of us would have a much better time with games if we just tried things out, even if we don't intend to complete everything we play. I've had my doubts about getting through even half of the games on my list these past 3 months, and so I am shocked at how many of them I've actually completed. But in that same sentence, I've also found myself emancipated by the mental fortitude to simply stop playing something the minute it is no longer fun or meaningful to me. That's the key to my being able to manage this project so far, I think. Success measured by a metric other than completion. Thank you for watching. If you've been playing along with me, here's the rota for Volume 2 of the Backlog Diaries. My shorter games for April will be Kowloon's Curse Lost Report, Rumu, Air, and Sludge Life. My longer game for the month will be the first 2 Hitman games, Codename 47 and Silent Assassin. My shorter games for May will be Ink, Delver, Mini Ninjas, and Super Hot. My longer game for the month will be EYE Divine Cybermancy. My shorter games for June will be Deus Ex Invisible War, Hyper Light Drifter, Super Brothers LP Sword and Sorcery, and 20XX. My longer game for the month will be Else.Heartbreak. God willing I have the time and enthusiasm, I will also intend across this period to dive deep on Monster Hunter Rise, a game I have already played a fair bit of and am well versed in, but never ventured into the serious business of. If you've reached the end of this horrendous slog of a video, thank you. This was a challenge to make, but not for the reasons I was expecting. I find writing about an individual game quite an easy experience, as often it's no sweat to bust out 500 to 700 words on even a fragment of an idea, but to do this 16 times over the course of several months was perhaps a tad too ambitious, especially given that in that time I also produced a video about 12 other games, as well as countless Substack posts, and I'm also in the weeds of another video project at the moment. Maybe one day I'll learn my lesson. But that day's not today, baby. What the hell is hubris anyway? See you next time.